I'm Daniel Benjamin, and I'm the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's lecture, The Russia Within, which will be delivered by Professor Paul Werth, who is the Spring 2023 Gerhard Kasper Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin. Most of you will know Gerhard Kasper, the longtime president of Stanford University, dean of the University of Chicago's Law School, and certainly in purely human terms, one of Germany's most important exports to the United States. Gerhard was a longtime trustee of the American Academy and had a profound effect on shaping it and its programming and its fundamental directions. And so this is a very happy occasion for us. This fellowship has been made possible through the generous support of the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And so I think it's appropriate to also mention our late trustee and really a beloved member of our board, Vartan Gregorian, who was president of Carnegie from 1997 until his passing in 2021. The former president of Brown University, former president of the New York Public Library, recipient of more honorary degrees and awards and fellowships than you can shake a stick at, as Groucho Marx used to say. Vartan Gregorian was awarded the National Humanities Medal in 1998 and the Medal of Freedom in 2004. He was a member of our board for 20 years, from 2001 until his death. And he was an extraordinary presence on our board, a man of really extraordinary range and wisdom. And we are really delighted that this fellowship, in a way, honors both of them. So Paul Werth, our speaker tonight, is working on the longue durée, the long history of the big territory of the world's largest country. A topic that is all too timely and relevant today, and which, if Paul does his job right, will give us some insight into how Russia has conceptualized and sought to reinforce the country's physical boundaries throughout history. This is sort of a busman's holiday for me. I get to introduce the introducer, and so it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Jurg Bobrowski, who will introduce Paul and we'll discuss with him after the talk. Professor Bobrowski is the chair in Eastern European history at the Humboldt University here in Berlin. He is the author of 8 works on the history of Russia, the Soviet Union, and the Stalinist terror. And before I hand the floor to Professor Bobrowski, let me just say a couple of quick words about our format. Paul Werth will speak for about 30 minutes, and we'll let him know if he goes much longer. And after that, he and Jurg will have a conversation, and then the Q&A will be opened up to the audience. And during this time, you'll all have an opportunity to ask questions. And I believe those who are watching us online can also send in their questions through the Zoom chat forum. I'm sorry, not the chat, actually. It's through the Q&A. And yeah, don't use the chat. So that was a Freudian sloop. So anyway, with that, let me welcome Professor Bobrowski.
So thank you very much for inviting me to this beautiful place. I've never been here, although I'm now here for 20 years. I'm teaching at Humboldt University. I've never been to the Wannsee and to the American Academy. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm happy to see all my American colleagues who work on Russian history, who gather in Berlin. And it's, of course, my honor and pleasure to introduce Paul Werth, a historian who received a PhD from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, in 1996, and who has been teaching Russian history at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas since 2010. In a place, I would say, that perhaps more than other places invites us to think about Russia, its present and past. I've never been to Las Vegas, but maybe I always thought about Las Vegas as a place, a Siberian place with warm weather. Maybe it's the right place for Russianists. In any case, the question of what a seemingly boundless empire is and by what spirit it maintains itself will be thought about differently in Nevada than in Heidelberg or Bologna. Paul is also a cosmopolitan in the best sense. He speaks Danish and Russian like his native tongue, is fluent in many other languages, for example, French, German, Tatar, and as I read in his CV, even Chinese. He has been a visiting scholar at Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich, at Hokkaido University in Sapporo, Japan, and he has, of course, close ties with Russia and its universities. Above all, Paul is a historian with a great sense of humor, and this is what I like most. People who like to laugh a lot, who look at their environment with a fine sense of irony, can also see the absurdity of what is happening before them. When I once asked a Moscow colleague in the 90s what the newly introduced Independence Day was all about, he replied that on this day, Russia celebrates the day when it became independent from the Ukraine. Paul, this sentence could have come from you as well. Paul understands Russia from his edges, from the periphery. His books and essays are attempts to understand Russia as a country of ethnic and religious diversity. We know that Russia was not and is not a nation state, but this insight did not matter much in the books of historians for a long time. The peripheries of the empire remained invisible in historical research in the past. In the 1990s, Paul Werth began to think about the question of what could be said about Russia if it were described from the perspective of its religious minorities. This led to the book At the Margins of Orthodoxy, Mission, Governance, and Confessional Politics in Russia's Volga-Kama region, 1827 to 1905, published in 2002. 12 years later, Paul wrote a book that placed the question of religious tolerance and freedom in a larger comparative and imperial context. The Tsar's Foreign Faiths, Toleration and the Fate of Religious Freedom in Imperial Russia. 2 years ago, his book, 1837, Russia's Quiet Revolution, was published. This work is truly an extraordinarily original. It breaks with the widespread notion that Russia at the beginning of the 19th century was an obscure, backward country ruled by a despot. Nicholas I was undoubtedly an embodiment of autocracy, but he was also the representative of a modern Russia ruled by bureaucracy. What happened in 1837? In 1837, Pushkin died as the result of a duel, and with his death began the cult of the founder of Russian literature. In 1837, Glinka composed A Life for the Tsar, Russia's first opera. In 1837, Chayadayev's Apology of a Madman appeared, claiming that Russia had no history and had given nothing to the world, a work that shook the intellectual world and sparked controversy over Russia's destiny. Also in 1837, the heir to the throne, later Alexander II, toured Siberia and got an idea of the empire's size and variety. In 1837, the first newspapers appeared in the Russian provinces. The Minister of State began to ease the lot of the state peasants. In 1837, there was the first attempt to conquer Central Asia. And in 1837, too, the first railroad line was built. It connected Petersburg with a castle in Tsarskoye Selo. I learned more about Russia's place in the world from this book than from all the learned treatises written on the subject. Paul is, one can say, is a master of the small form, the miniature that lets the reader see the bigger pictures, and unveils unseen connections. So I hope it will be again today. His new project, about which he will speak to us tonight, is about the territory of Russia. He is writing a territorial history of Russia, the history of Russia within. Russia's history is the history of a country colonizing itself, the great Russian historian Vasily Kluchevsky once wrote. And by that he meant that Russia is contourless, defined by moving borders. Sergei Witte, who had been finance minister under Alexander III and prime minister under Nicholas II, wrote in his memoirs that Russia did not exist at all, that Russia had always been an empire only, but not a nation or a nation-state. But according to Witte, this is where its tragedy lies. Russia will only be able to be Russia if once it ceases to be an empire. But to do this, it must first know what it is. Paul Werth will now speak to us about this, and as always, give us an answer that will make us think. Paul, you have the floor.
Well, all right, good Lord. That was very generous. I guess I should start by saying that it looks to me like some expect a discourse now in verse. And many therefore may object and gnash their teeth and curse to learn that I forego this mode because they think they're surely owed some entertainment, yes, some fun. Alas, the answer this time's no. I know it brings but rue and woe. With poetry, I'm almost done. I say it now so each here knows. Tonight, I'll do this one in prose. But first, let me thank the staff of this extraordinary institution for creating an extraordinary experience, my fellow fellows here for their fellowship, all of you for coming this evening. I'm really more honored than you can possibly imagine. To Professor Jorg Barbarovsky for introducing me so nicely, and also to my wife Yelizaveta, who right now happens to be in the place that I want to talk about. The topic is indeed Russia, everybody's favorite country nowadays. And I have in mind a particular problem lurking within or behind that very label, Russia. And the problem is what I call Russia within. And what might that mean? Well, in a nutshell, I have in mind the identifiably, perhaps one could say ethnically Russian, part of larger political formations like the Russian Empire and the USSR. And I'm proposing, in other words, that over history, but I would say principally over the course of the last 2 centuries or so, there have been both a larger Russia, that is the empire, the USSR, and a smaller one, the Russia within. The distinction is critical, I think, for understanding both the country's history and actually the present crisis as well. Now, the Russian within, what a concept. I can see it already. Inquisitive listeners are asking, heads cocked to one side. Skeptical ones are demanding, their arms folded in demonstrable defiance. Where would this idea come from? It comes from a broader interest that I have in borders, territory, and sovereignty. Indeed, my plan is to write a history of the world's longest border, the one that now extends some 20,000 kilometers or so, encloses Russia. Of course, it's even longer if we take into account the maritime border. And I'm asking 2 very basic questions, because basic questions are usually the best ones. How did Russia enter and contribute to the bordered world as it now exists? And what role did borders play in making Russia itself? But it occurred to me that I first needed to tell a closely related but different story. And that's the story of Russia's territorial scope. I needed to answer, in my view, a basic question: where was Russia when and why was it there? And only then could I take up the issue of borders. So I'm composing a little book called A Territorial History of Russia. By necessity, I have to cover 7 centuries, and I will do so. By necessity, I must cover 3 continents, and I'm doing it. I'm working as fast as I can. And by choice, and here I'm really starting to question my judgment, I've agreed to write an absurdly concise text, namely 120 pages. The challenge is intriguing, but immense, but broad accessibility is my goal, and from that standpoint, Lenin's famous dictum, better less but better, лучше меньше да лучше, is quite opposite. So how does one write a history like this? Probably there are lots of ways to do it. Here's mine. Imagine a story in 2 parts. So the first part, I posit a series of historical phases, starting in around the year 1300. Each phase exhibits initially growth and then crisis. The crisis typically included territorial retrenchment or even challenge to the country's sovereign existence. In my reading, there are 4 such crisis periods we can point to. The first one is in the so-called time of troubles, culminating in the year 1611. The second one is the period of the Revolution and Civil War, culminating in 1919. The third, in the Second World War, the farthest Nazi advance into Soviet territory, 1942, and then the dissolution of the USSR in 1991, and I can't help thinking there might be another one coming soon. After each of these crises, though, it has to be said, Russia in its various guises, its various forms, rebounded and recorded territorial growth in the aftermath, even in this last case, in the case of 1991. And I think this structure suggests maybe some deeper rhythms to Russia's territorial history, even as, of course, crucial aspects of the story remain a function of contingency. I top this off with a brief exploration of the reasons for Russia's expansion across the centuries, ideology, matters of prestige, aspiration for trade and resources, the geography itself, all of these things enter into this. And it's notable as well that Russia's expansion, its imperial growth, generally coincided historically with that of other empires. And this confirms a thought by the historian Charles Meyer at Harvard. He posits an imperial glaciation by which empires tend to come in groups and clusters. That is, empires tend to reinforce one another's structural and spatial ambitions. Throughout, I also discuss, needless to say, in absurd brevity, changing conceptions of territoriality and sovereignty, drawing actually on the work of a lot of people who are sitting in this room and presumably the next one as well. So that's part 1, a nice, clean, coherent narrative, and of course it's too clean, which brings us to part 2. Here I posit 2 basic complications to the foregoing narrative. One complication is that all that stuff I just talked about essentially dwells on direct and exclusive forms of sovereignty. But Russia's territorial history has included other forms as well. So, for example, protectorates such as Poland, Lithuania, there in the 18th century at the top, or the Emirate of Bukhara in Central Asia, there you can see along with Khiva actually down below. Things like temporary occupations in Romania, which has been occupied numerous times, Manchuria there on the left in the early 20th century, or the Danish island of Bornholm. My Danish aunt is here, so I had to throw in the one Danish territory that was occupied. I want to make sure we got that one. Distant colonial outposts such as Fort Ross in Northern California, which I recommend visiting if you ever go to San Francisco. Also spheres of influence from those in the Mongolian world to Iran, and then of course to those that are closer to home here in East Central Europe after the Second World War. But also things like leases. Russia leased the Chinese Eastern Railway across Manchuria in the early 20th century, and it leases now the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. And there are elements of territoriality there. And I'll add also probably at least a little bit about Antarctica. For example, the base here at Vostok, where Soviet scientists in 1983 recorded the lowest temperature ever on the face of the planet, 89.2 degrees Celsius below zero, which in Fahrenheit, in case you were wondering, is 126.6 below zero. That's one you can share with your friends, postal carriers, pets, and houseplants. I'm just Guess people weren't impressed by that. I thought someone was going to say, good God, that's cold. All right. Ask me how hot it is in Las Vegas. Maybe that'll impress you. So all of this basically represents what I would call Russia beyond. That is, it's areas beyond the country's formal borders, but places where Russia still had an important territorial presence, a footprint, if you will. And if there was a Russia beyond, then I suppose logic would suggest that there's also a Russia within, and that's the topic I'd like to take up today. Part of the issue of doing this is simply to acknowledge that the country that interests me has long been something more than just Russia, as the very country's name suggests. The Russian Empire, the USSR, the Russian Federation today, Muscovy way back when. But the issue also concerns the emergence of a more limited Russia within these larger formations. So I'll admit that for most of the early modern period into the early years of the empire, this was not a serious issue. So Muscovy, the early empire, these were multinational dynastic states. Russians and non-Russians coexisted on a broad territory. There was no great need to make a fundamental distinction among them or among the territories that they inhabited. All were subjects of the Tsar, and in some ways that was the important thing. But gradually we begin to see the idea that there was a Russia within this larger empire. And I think we can, simplifying, identify two basic sources for this. One is the empire's expansion, well beyond areas where Russians made up even a minority of the population. And the other is the rise of the national idea, which induced people to think more about national distinctions, national categories. And we can see this Russia within actually emerging across the 19th century in a variety of interesting ways. So if we take 1812, when the Napoleonic forces invade the country, the Tsar's army is retreating across that orangish or tannish territory. Officers' memoirs indicate clearly that the town of Smolensk, which you can see here, that this town signaled a boundary after which the army saw itself defending not just the empire, but Russian national territory. And they talked about birch trees and so forth as if these other places didn't have birch trees, but that was how they wrote about it. In 1837, on that trip that Professor Babirovsky referred to, Nicholas I, the man on the top, wrote to his son, the man on the bottom, the grand prince and heir to the throne, as he took a tour throughout Europe, that only when the young man arrived from Petersburg in the town of Tver, only then was he actually entering, and here I quote, the heart of Russia, which is to say that the imperial capital was not in the heart of Russia. The geography Konstantin Arseniev in 1848 posited an interior, as he called it, or central Russia, the true fatherland of the Russians, he called it, the great circle to which all of the remaining parts of the empire connect like radii. And ethnographic cartography, the image we had up there at the beginning, also made it possible to reveal in striking visual fashion those portions of the country where Russians, or at least East Slavs, we'll come to the distinction here in a minute, where those people predominated. And so if you could look at this map, just to clarify a little bit, the farthest western bit in the sharpest red are Poles, that is Western Slavs, but everything else that's sort of yellow, pink, or reddish, those are all East Slavs, most of them confessing Orthodoxy, and then there are some distinctions among them that we'll come to in a minute. But the larger point I want to make at this moment is that this ethnographic cartography allowed one to now visually see basically the Russia within, which I don't think was visible, at least in the same way, before. Now, this concept was not entirely stable. It could grow to include areas with significant non-Russian populations. If you look, for example, somewhat to the east, you see a greater cluster of non-Russian peoples. That could eventually be claimed as Russian. Or if you look at Crimea in the south, and everybody knows where Crimea is now, that also had a significant non-Russian population. But that also could be imagined as Russian national space that just happened to have, in effect, national minorities present as well. Even immense Siberia could be imagined by the late 19th century as an essential component, you could say, of Russia itself. Still, a basic question remained: where actually did Russian territory end, even if the answer was changing? In the country's west, there were certain distinct territorial entities that helped to define or to answer that question. They helped define the limits of Russia within, in part because they had fairly clear borders that distinguished them from the rest of the empire. And I'm just going to address one of these units. There are only a couple, but one of them here, and that's the Kingdom of Poland. What this reveals, I think, if we look at this, is even a brief account of the history of its internal border with Russia, which is very interesting, is that this border with Russia proper, that is the Russia on the interior, was neither stable nor was it uncontested. So the Kingdom of Poland is a curious entity that was created in 1815 at the Congress of Vienna, which terminated the Napoleonic Wars. And it represented a reward of sorts for Russia's central role in the defeat of Napoleon. It was also a relatively imaginative way, it seems to me, for Russia to address its Polish problem. So there's a bit of Poland basically on the edge of Russia, you could say. But two other points. The kingdom was not incorporated into Russia sort of directly, but it was rather sort of affixed to it, with the Russian emperor as its king. And while the Congress of Vienna specified the western border of the Kingdom of Poland, it said nothing about the eastern border. So on several occasions, what we see are different parties raising the issue of the kingdom's possible reunion with other provinces on the interior of Russia. So to clarify this map, the bit in yellow are the territories that Russia took from Poland in the partitions of the second half of the 18th century. And the Kingdom of Poland is that kind of, I don't know what you would call it, blue-green thing sort of in the center with the odd shape. And so the issue here pertains to the relationship between these two territories. Even Alexander I himself, the emperor, raised this issue of unification of these two territories shortly after he created the Kingdom of Poland. This idea encountered strong resistance from the Russian elite, however. The famous writer and historian Nikolai Karamzin famously wrote to the sovereign in 1819 with the following: "Up to now, our rule of state has always been not 1 inch to either friend or foe." Even so, little known is the fact that in 1822, shortly after this, Alexander, that is the emperor, extended the authority of the kingdom's viceroy, that is his brother Constantine, extended his authority to some of the internal provinces. So there was a partial realization of that reunification. Poles themselves raised the issue again in the late 1850s. They were rebuffed. "Not 1 inch of land may be yielded to the kingdom," wrote the interior minister in 1862. Polish rebels raised the issue on 2 occasions, in 1830 and 1863, though in both cases the insurrection was suppressed, but the goal was, among other things, to unite those 2 segments of Russian Poland. By the 1890s, Russian nationalists pushed for the border's revision in the opposite direction. So a portion of the kingdom's population was Russian, they claimed. This was at the sort of the far southeastern edge of the kingdom. They claimed those people were Russian, and the relevant territory should therefore be excised, that is, separated from the Kingdom of Poland and attached to the empire proper. This is, again, this largely brown segment of the kingdom. And this excision and this transfer did indeed occur in 1912 as Holm province, that is on the eve of the First World War. What is the point that I'm trying to make in all of this? The point is that this seemingly stable entity, the Kingdom of Poland, this was news to me, maybe people know about this stuff, I don't know, that helped to define these internal contours of Russia, was actually a site of territorial contestation throughout the 19th century. And its border was eventually altered to accommodate the claim that part of it represented Russian national territory. Now, central in all of this, of course, is the fundamental question of who counts as Russian. So the Russians, I'll put it in quotation mark here, in Holm province, were actually Ukrainians, or at least that's what many people would say today. Different shadings of red on this map that I return to here also show the internal divisions, distinctions among the East Slavic people. So generally in the West, you have Belarusians in the north, Ukrainians in the south, so-called Great Russians, or what we would call Russians, in the pinkest of the colors. And from around the 1840s or so, some Ukrainians are beginning to construe themselves as a people related to, but nonetheless distinct from, Russians. And similar expressions from Belarusians come, although they come somewhat later. From this perspective, Ukrainians and Belarusians were distinct peoples. And this is a conception familiar to us because we see a country for each of these peoples on maps today, however contested their borders. But there was another conception that existed at the same time, one positing a single big Russian nation. It acknowledged these regional and linguistic differences, but insisted that all three of these peoples, I'm sorry, I should use the plural, Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, that they were all essentially one, and that they would eventually merge into a single unified nation. This was the view of the imperial government and of Russian nationalists, and it is, of course, reflected in the things that Vladimir Putin has to say today. In historical terms, though, I would emphasize neither of these two conceptions was right or wrong. They were both political projects. That is, they were blueprints for the future. But of course, choosing one over the other would have immense consequence for defining the scope of Russian national space. The latter conception, I'll just note almost in passing, although it's not really just in passing, the latter conception, the big Russian nation, allowed Russian nationalists to construe the East Slavic populations of Austria and Hungary as Russians. You can see them there basically where it says Ukrainians, basically that, the pink basically extending over into the border of Austrian Galicia and even further into the Kingdom of Hungary within Austria-Hungary. These people too were claimed as Russians. And indeed a partial attempt to unite those people with Russia occurred under the Tsarist military occupation of the region in 1914 to 15. Now, the larger point that I'm trying to make in all of this is that the aspiration to identify a Russia within was perhaps an inevitable consequence of the appearance of the national idea in a country that had become an immense empire. But I would also add that because Russia retained, even in its later years, a strongly dynastic sense, that is, the emphasis was on loyalty to the Tsar, there was no fundamental need to define the borders of Russia within. And there was the ideas appearing. One could talk about it, one could debate, but you didn't need to draw these borders. This then changes with the creation of the USSR. The USSR was a different kind of political formation. It consisted of national republics joined together as formally equal units in a Soviet Union. That was the name of the country. And this meant that the borders of Russia within now had to be drawn clearly and explicitly. Or, more accurately, the borders of other republics had to be drawn, and Russia would be whatever was left over. And in effect, what was left over was something known as the RSFSR, the Russian Socialist Federated Soviet Republic. And it's the pink stuff. It's most of the country. It's true, at least at this point. And about its borders, I just want to make 4 basic points, though I have to say that Stefan Rindlisbacher, who's here somewhere, probably knows more about this than I do. The first point I want to make is that drawing these borders of Russia within was a contentious process at times, especially in the West. We saw those ethnographic maps. It was almost impossible to draw a clear line between Russians on the one hand and Belarusians and Ukrainians on the other. Sometimes people slated for transfer to another republic said they didn't want to go. Some Belarusians explained in Belarusian that they only spoke Russian. But the Bolsheviks, I think, tried to identify an internal border that would encompass the Belarusian population. And partly for that reason, Belarus actually became considerably larger in 1924 and 1926. So the darkest color here, the darkest tan or whatever it is, was the sort of original, not quite original, but sort of kind of original Belarusian Soviet Republic. And then those bits in the northeast, and then also some things down in the southeast, these were added in 1924 and 26. Establishing the border of the Ukrainian Republic with the RSFSR took a good portion of the 1920s with claims, counterclaims, and much wrangling and mutual recrimination. And now we have some really good literature on precisely this issue. So if we look at Ukraine. It would be wrong, by the way, to say that all of this was imposed by Moscow from above. Local communists were very much involved in the process. And ultimately, so you can see, basically, if you look at this map, I apologize, it is in Russian, but all of those territories are sort of along the edge were contested or claimed. Some of them moved, some of them didn't. Some went over, some came back. And ultimately, several factors had to be balanced in all of this. The national composition of the territories, which itself was very difficult to ascertain. The aspirations of the population there, which did not always align with nationality. It wasn't always as if Ukrainians said, put us in the Ukrainian Republic. And economic considerations, as well as just administrative efficiency, having relatively straight borders, making sure that villages were not cut off from important commercial centers, etc. So recognizing all of that was very, very difficult. So that's the first point. It was contentious. Second of all, over the course of the process, the RSFSR lost territory. It yielded territory to Belarus and Ukraine in the way that I just described. It ceded territory in Central Asia when these republics down here, basically to the east of the Caspian Sea, I guess I would say, when those all became national republics within the Soviet Union, that process had been completed by 1936. It ceded a new Karelo-Finnish Union Republic that was created in 1940 on the border with Finland. And it also yielded Crimea to Ukraine in 1954. If we compare two maps, which is quite interesting, of the RSFSR, that's the red, in 1922, and the RSFSR in 1940, you can see that there's a quite significant difference. That is the RSFSR before, or in 1922, I should say, and the RSFSR in 1940. Now, true, there were some cases where the RSFSR gained territory from other Soviet republics. This did happen. In 1925, at the far end, that sort of far end territory that sort of gridded or lined, that was territory that was transferred to Ukraine initially and then came back to the RSFSR in 1925 after further delineation and demarcation. That same year, some modifications happened in Central Asia, whereby the Kazakh Republic, initially that green color, gained extensive territory in the south, the pink or purple, and then gave up basically some territory in the north, including Orenburg, which was the original capital of Kazakhstan. That also happened in 1925. In 1944, when Estonia and Latvia were reabsorbed into the USSR at the end of the war, they also yielded territory, the red bits basically there, and then there were some territorial modifications for Lithuania that were mostly to the benefit of Lithuania, but that's a separate story. And then finally, I'll come back to this, that Karelian Republic, that Finno-Karelian Republic, was demoted down to a lower level in 1956, which meant that it was reincorporated into the RSFSR. But so there were cases where the RSFSR gained territory, but generally speaking, I think this is my understanding, borders were drawn to favor non-Russian territories at the expense of the RSFSR. And Ukraine probably is the one important exception. I think Ukraine could reasonably claim that several million compatriots were outside of the Ukrainian Republic in the border regions after those borders had been more or less finalized. And it seems to me that there were just real apprehensions among the Bolsheviks about allowing Ukraine to be too big and about whether or not they were potentially antagonizing Russians too much by giving Ukraine too much territory. But the larger point is that the RSFSR lost territory over the course of its existence. I think that's a true statement. Third, the RSFSR was the most federated of all the Union republics. It was the only one that had an F for federated in its title, with the exception of a federated republic in the Caucasus, which existed only for a relatively brief time. It also consisted of various autonomous republics. So if you look at this map, all of them defined in national or ethnic terms. So on this map, basically, I'm simplifying a bit, but everything that's yellow or orange, and some of the things that are gray later, those all basically became autonomous national units, autonomous republics. There were 16 of these in the RSFSR by the 1980s. Only 4 other republics of the USSR had any such autonomous republics within them, and only one, Georgia, had 2 of them, had more than one, that is 2. All of those autonomous spaces, all of that yellow and orange, all of that was also constituted, in effect, non-Russian space, or was kind of labeled non-Russian space. And their leaders, I think, tried, within the constraints of a highly centralized system, they tried to maximize their local decision-making powers. So the Soviet Russia within, in other words, was partly and indeed explicitly non-Russian. And in fact, I would go so far as to say, and this is fourth, that the RSFSR was itself not really Russian. Stalin claimed explicitly at one point that there was no ethnic Russian republic in the USSR. Discussions among non-Russians in the RSFSR indicate that many of them shared that view. That is, they didn't regard those supposedly Russian parts of the RSFSR as actually Russian. The Bolsheviks didn't really know what to do, I think, with Russians. The USSR was designed, among other things, to downplay Russian national self-expression in order to forestall a defensive nationalism on the part of non-Russians. So the RSFSR remained largely a non-national, everything else kind of residual republic. The Soviet Russia within, you could say, was definitely within. If you look at this map basically from after the Second World War, you can see that it's very much within. Between Finland on the one hand and China, Mongolia on the other, it had no border with a foreign state, except for that small bit of the Kaliningrad exclave. So other Soviet republics stood between it and foreign countries. So it was definitely within, but it was only partially and conditionally Russian. Sort of, kind of, but not really. Such then was the grand trajectory of Russia within. Not much of an issue before the 19th century. From there, a combination of imperial expansion and the national idea made Russia within imaginable, perhaps even necessary. The idea set important elements of an agenda within the country, that is trying to convince Ukrainians and Belarusians that they were Russian, and outside also, certain parts of Austria and Hungary, by one view at least, belonged with Russia or to Russia in this conception. But in the empire, defining the borders of Russia within was not pressing. It wasn't as though it had to be done. In the USSR, by contrast, those borders had to be drawn. And they were. But partly as a result, the Russian question became effectively less Russian. Here's another way to think about the matter. In the empire, I think what we see is an attempt to define Russia itself, leaving the residual stuff outside on the edges as the empire, the rest, not Russia. And in the USSR, we in effect see the opposite, an attempt to define non-Russian national spaces, leaving the residual as the Russian interior, although only partially and conditionally for the reasons we've seen. And I would say today, I don't want to venture too much into the present, but I think we probably have to say something. The contemporary Russian Federation has inherited, I think, some of these ambiguities. In some ways, I think it has become more of a Russian national state. Polls even in the 1990s would suggest this. But it's also inherited key elements from the past, including its formal federal structure. And talk of territorial revision has been an element of Russian discourse since the breakup. Now, my fellow Russianists in the audience, I'm not sure if that's even a legitimate term anymore, Russianist, but may now be thinking, there's really not very much new here, is there, Paul? To which I answer, yeah, maybe not. My work at this stage is principally a matter of synthesis. It's for broader audiences, for students, for diplomats, for people whose internet has gone out. I think the current war also places all of this in a new light. I just think that these are issues we have to revisit, I think, and revisit again. We inevitably think about these things differently when we don't even know what the map is going to look like in 5 years, or for that matter, even next week. At the same time, I'd venture maybe an ounce of novelty in what I've had to say today. We've never had so much solid and deep research with which to tell this story. So it's partly for this reason that I want to assemble what we have and see what comes of it. I don't think anyone has connected the problem of Russia within to a territorial history that pertains primarily to the outer or external borders of the country. I'm trying to propose a link here, the idea that expansion helped to produce the necessity of an internal center, so to speak, and that Russia within represents the obverse, if you will, of Russia beyond in the way that I've described. I don't think anybody's used the expression Russia within, which I now trademark, TM. And I don't think anyone's told the story in 5,500 words, or for that matter, in half an hour. Thank you.
First of all, I would like to ask why your book starts with the crisis of 1613. The German philosopher Karl Löwit, he was from one of the pupils of Heidegger in Freiburg. He once wrote in a book on philosophy of history that the past is not the preparation of the future. And I think he was right in saying that. But of course, historians don't like that. But nonetheless, I would like to ask if we really have to know what happened in 1613 to understand what happened in 1861, and if it's really necessary to think about the national experience of Tsarist Russia to understand the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so I would like to ask you if this is a book who is considering situations in which people do something, or is it a Is it what historians always do? Beginning in the Middle Ages and ending and thinking that there is a connection with all these events.
I'll start with a less highfalutin dictum. You got to start somewhere.
That's true.
You do have to start somewhere. And I don't really start it in 1611 or 1613. I started in 1300 because I think there's... Okay. What I'm suggesting is that there are stages of growth and then crisis. And I think what you see is a stage of growth, basically, that I think we can trace back to around 1300 when Moscow is a relative, actually quite small principality. Nobody would give it much of a chance for ruling a sixth of the globe at that point. The odds in Las Vegas would not be very good. And yet, by the time we get to the early 17th century, it's actually achieved something quite extraordinary, and that is it's basically bested many of its rivals locally. And it does seem to me that that's... some people will say that the beginning of the empire in Russia dates to the year 1552, which is when Russia conquered the Khanate of Kazan on the Volga River. But that was the first sort of organized, in this case, Muslim state, and it signifies the birth of the empire. But I see no reason to suppose, and I think early modern scholars, there are some in this group who can disabuse me of this conception if I'm wrong. I think they would probably say that the people who belong to the various principalities in the early modern period, by which I mean the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, I see no reason to suppose that they weren't attached to their political units and their dynasties more than anybody else later was. And we sort of assume, because all of these people in effect become Russian, we assume that that's what they always were, whereas I think there's actually considerable evidence to show that there were strong affinities that people had with those earlier principalities, which is another way of saying, I think, to come back to maybe the fundamental aspect of the question. What am I trying to get back to? Yes. And that is that I think if empire is one of the tropes or one of the explanatory mechanisms that we're using, and I think we have to use it in the case of Russia, I think we have to say basically that empire building in some ways is happening from the very beginning. It's happening in Moscow with respect to these principalities that some of the Russianists will know, Rostov and Novgorod and so forth and so on, that very few other people know. And my idea, in part, and especially in a short book like this, is in, let's see if I can remember, 5,000 words or less, basically tell people who don't want to get bogged down in this, nonetheless give them an understanding of it. Okay. So it does seem to me that there is a longer story and there's a longer pattern. I'm not sure, I'm not trying to use the pattern as an explanatory mechanism, at least not yet. I'm not sure that one can say that because there's been this pattern in the past. I think there are good reasons to think that actually the pattern has been broken now, quite honestly, and we can talk about that. But it does seem to me there are these patterns, and I think they emerge actually most vividly and most clearly, you know, when you can actually trace several of these, in this case 4, of these various crises. And it also had to do with, I presented this at universities, the idea when I was just beginning, where there were, you know, a strong contingent of early modern people, and they made the case, I thought, very, very effectively, that you really have to include those earlier periods, and that the time of troubles in the early 17th century is an absolutely critical moment in Russian history. And I think that's exactly right. I think it's actually astonishing that the country didn't collapse entirely. I think it's in some ways a miracle. Maybe that was a bad thing. I don't know. That's a different matter. But
is it a country?
I'm sorry?
Is it a country?
Is it? That's another question, right? But the point is that what, you know, that entity that later became Russia, you know, could have just basically dissipated and disappeared at that time.
Yeah, where was Russia when, you said? This is I would say, a very, very difficult question to answer in a 120-page book. And the problem is that people think of themselves, especially in times of crisis, when they are challenged by other people. They used to think about their place in the world. And so the problem is that when you were talking about where Russia was and when, you were talking about the ruling elites defining themselves, the Slavophiles and the nobility. But the problem is that there were different conceptions of what Russia was in the 19th century and the 20th century. So there was the Russia of Alexander III, which was very different for what the Slavophiles thought about Russia. So the notion that Russia could be something like the French, a nation state, an empire as a nation state, which was something Tsar Alexander III would have liked, but this was not something the Slavophiles would have preferred. And then I would say there was a Russia of the German nobility of the Baltics. They had also a notion of what Russia within is. And of course you have all the national minorities. There's also a Georgian perception of Russia. And so I worked on the Caucasus and on Azerbaijan, and I found it very, very difficult to say what Russia is, because there are so many people who are engaged in that discussion of what Russia is. And of course, the Slavophiles and all the nationalists in Russia, they were confronted by Baltic nationalists, by Georgians, and by all the other people who inhabited the huge empire. How can you solve that very difficult problem?
That's a real challenge. I agree. And what I don't want to suggest that anything that I'm sort of describing here, and maybe I should have said this, that it has gone uncontested. And even what I want to suggest, I think, even just about the relatively brief, really thumbnail sketch that I provided here, was not necessarily that there was coalescing a clear and uncontested conception of this Russia within, say, for example, and not to say that there weren't others both within, like, who could be considered Russian on the one hand, or those who outside of the Russian community on the other, who had different views or different conceptions. There was also, I think the regime's conception to a large extent remained largely an imperial and dynastic one, which I think to a certain extent, I would say to a large extent, shunned these kinds of national distinctions, not entirely, but certainly in a territorial sense, I think until the very end. I think at the very end you start to see it, but I think to the very end, there's no reorganization, with the exception of Home Province in 1912. There's no reorganization, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, no reorganization of territory on a kind of national foundation. There was only one territorial unit, as far as I know, that was actually named, you could say even only provisionally in ethnic terms in the Russian Empire. That was the Armenian region from 1828 to 1840. But I think that was more a kind of description of the region rather than it belonging to a particular people. So I think you're right that all those conceptions are there. And what's to be done? Anytime we tell any kind of story, we engage in a certain degree of simplification. When we write a 500-page book, we engage in a certain kind of simplification. But obviously, we're able to give greater voice to differing perspectives, differing tendencies, differing trends. And when one writes a relatively short book, then obviously the degree of simplification and the degree of exclusion, let's put it honestly, we can say it on the table, is going to be greater. But I think there are ways, I'm going to hope, and I'm trying to build this, and this conversation is going to push me in this direction, to think about ways to incorporate not extensive discussions of these issues, but indications that there is obviously a deeper and greater degree of complexity behind it. I agree with you fundamentally. In some ways, actually, what I've written about the 19th century is I've written the least about it because I'm so afraid of going into it, because it's something that I've been working on basically for the last 25 years of my life. And I'm afraid that, so I'm trying to sort of remain above it and imagine somebody who wants to have a sense for what's going on in this country over the long haul. What do you tell this person? What does this person need to know? I don't know. Perhaps it might be a fool's errand. Perhaps it's a bad idea. But I do think that writing in that sort of concise way.
No, it's of course not a bad idea. Yeah. It's a great idea, and it will be a great book, no doubt. But
well, I don't know about that.
But I would address this kind of problems. For example, if you take the early Soviet Union, I think it's not by accident that Stalin who came from Georgia, he was interested in what Russia was. But Lenin was not interested in that. For Lenin, it was important to build socialism, to reach the people in their languages. That was for practical reasons. But for Stalin, ethnicity was really a big issue. And in that sense, I would say it would be great just to mention all the different conceptions of empire and nation that were present in Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union.
I agree. Yeah.
I hope that these 3 questions were intelligent enough, and so that,
that
I can invite
probing.
you to participate in the discussion. So who would like to start? I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Yeah, there's a question there. Yeah, we should get. I think because there are people in the next room, and there's also people at home.
Oh, okay.
So there's a fellow there.
Thank you. I'm an American Studies student from Humboldt University. I just wondered, since you mentioned the colony, or the outpost that Russia had on the American mainland, and Alaska, obviously, whether maybe it's not, helpful to think of Russia as a colonial power that, just went to the Pacific the other way around. And maybe it's just, maintaining sort of like the colonies that it amassed. And that's like maybe today's reason of being for whatever Russia is. Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, if I'm understanding correctly, then in essence, basically a question about empire, and I think that's really the red thread here, and the issue of, I guess, colonialism and colonies specifically. And I'm looking at what I think is Martina, because she's I would ask her this question, quite honestly, because she's written about this quite extensively. I think it's worth noting that, and Martina will correct me if I'm wrong, I do believe that Alaska was the only territory that Russia referred to officially as a colony, or they actually referred them in the plural as the colonies. But of course, the relationship that the center of the Russian Empire had, let's say St. Petersburg, to some of these other outlying regions clearly could also be described as a colonial relationship. And I think there were many people, Russians included. In fact, Arseniev, the geographer whom I mentioned, in that same work where he talked about the inner circle, I mean, one of the points that he was making was that there were other parts of the country, by which he meant the empire, and he specified, he talked about Finland, he talked about the Caucasus, which is the reason, of course, that you were talking about a moment ago, and says these places are not part of the center of Russia. And he even said we could call these the colonies of Russia. So I think there is, in answer to the question, I guess I would say that there was one set of territories that I guess were labeled colonies specifically, explicitly, and then there were others that not officially, but even people at the time called colonies. And I think there are territories that we today would probably regard as colonies too. But I would say that most of those territories, certainly the ones that would have been considered colonies in the 19th century, even by a broad conception, those are no longer part of Russia, whose territory right now is pretty close to what it was in the 17th century, quite honestly. Does that answer the question? I'm hoping it did.
Sort of, although I would argue that people, on the very fringes in Siberia do not necessarily consider themselves Russian, right? They have, their own identities as Chukchin or... Sure. Absolutely.
Should I read the questions from Zoom first, or?
Maybe.
Sure, maybe. Okay.
Thank you for the amazing lecture and this very interesting insights. I'm a journalist. I'm Susanne Koller with the German news magazine Der Spiegel, foreign correspondent. And so we journalists are mainly interested certainly in how this is playing into the current situation. And I'm wondering whether you could answer the question to which Russia is President Putin referring to when he is regarding Ukraine as a part of the Russian nation. And maybe, and this is a more difficult question, maybe also unfair to ask, how many people would identify with that?
Yeah. This is a hard question. I don't know how many times I hear people say, here's what Putin is thinking. And I think to myself, like, how exactly do you know this? I mean, I think what we can draw inferences, of course, based on what he says. And I think that his so-called article in July of 2021, that is roughly 6 months, half a year before the invasion, I think is a really interesting document from that standpoint. And it seems to me as though in that document he's saying lots of interesting things. It's a certain kind of line of historical interpretation that I think has some truth to it, at least in my reading, but I think also includes, and this I think is characteristic of many of the things that regime says, it's a combination basically of some truth, a great deal of lies, and some sort of half-truths. And that's what makes it so difficult to unpack, is to sort of sort it all out. It seems to me that he's talking really quite very much in the language of that old kind of imperial conception, that is that there are three peoples who constitute the Russian people in a grander sense, that there are these distinctions. He's negated the existence or denied the existence of Ukrainians. And so I think what you see is that this conception was able, even though the structure of the Soviet Union was different in the sense that the Soviet Union acknowledged the existence of these other two East Slavic peoples, Belarusians and Ukrainians, it nonetheless, that conception nonetheless underneath the surface was able to continue to exist. And it was perhaps fostered in Russian nationalist circles, and then it can actually reappear. I mean, Alexander Solzhenitsyn is a large proponent of this in the very early 90s, when there's still the question of whether or not the Soviet Union is going to fall apart. So it seems to me, I mean, the way I read Vladimir Putin today, it seems like this conception, which we see developed in the 19th century, in the early 20th, it seems to me like it's quite alive in what he has to say. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are some nuances around the edges, of course. I mean, he acknowledged in some sense the history. He complains about, I mean, he has this, in that very article, he has this line where he says, the Bolsheviks like to draw all these, slice off all these nice territorial gifts, give it to other republics. One thing is obvious, he says, Russia was robbed. Well, I mean, one can agree in the sense that the RSFSR is sort of reduced in size, though there were good political reasons why the Bolsheviks and others involved in that process, chose to go that route. I mean, it was a set of compromises and concessions that I think they had to make. This is something that I think Putin is not willing to recognize. It's as if somebody was sitting in Moscow or wherever and saying, oh, we'll just draw that line, we'll draw that line. And I think Stefan Rindlisberger, who's grimacing over there, rightly so. I mean, he's written a really remarkable article. I mean, I'm drawing on him in no small measure about the border between, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, Stefan, but if the hard question comes, you're going to answer it.
You already urged me to ask one question.
Yeah, all right, well, okay. But Stefan wrote this really great article about the border in the 1920s, how it was just, devised between the Ukrainian Republic and the RSFSR. And what you see is a lot of contention. You see a lot of people trying to figure out, a lot of people, I think, Stefan, it seemed to me a lot of people trying to make a reasonable decision based on the information that they had. Like, what do the people want? How can we have a line that will be relatively clear and logical? How do we define who these people are? So it wasn't like it was some game or anything like this. It was, well, going back to your point, I mean, I'm not sure which sort of conception of ethnicity, a kind of instrumental one or a genuine one, is operative here. Probably elements of both, because there are so many people involved in the process. There actually are these commissions. There are local communists who are involved in this process. And all of them are asking the question, at least where and when the question pertains to the issue of the borders of the RSFSR, in a sense, where are the borders of Russia? Of course, they're interested in other borders too. They had to draw a border between Belarus and Ukraine. That also wasn't easy. And the border between Kazakhstan and Russia, or the borders in Central Asia, were extremely difficult to sort out, or in the Caucasus as well, right? These were very, very difficult issues. But I don't know, you've done close research on this. I mean, wouldn't you say that that the efforts to draw these kinds of borders that the political leadership was really trying to draw these borders in a way that would actually make ethnographic and economic sense?
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
And the local elites were part of that.
Yeah, very much so.
And they were pressing issues in Moscow. Of
Yeah,
course, and
yeah.
the Nagorno-Karabakh issue, that was decided in Baku and not in Moscow.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. Hopefully it does, at least in part.
Okay, may I read the three questions from Zoom?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, the first is Luise Lechner. Thank you so much for this interesting lecture. Is there still an impact of the Alaska Purchase? And after World War II with Japan, referring the Kuril Islands? This is the first question. The second is from Jeffrey Feldman. Paul, that was great. Wish I were with you in person. Could you talk about how important really were the internal boundaries of the Soviet Union? It was a different way of organizing the state compared to the empire, without question. But demographically and politically, did those boundaries really mean much? It was all the Soviet Union. And the third question is Daniel Werth. So that must be your son, I guess.
I suspect it is, yeah. Привет, малыш.
Yeah, he has also a good sense of humor. Greetings from Las Vegas. You mentioned that, for example, in the various transfers of territory between the USSR and the other SSRs, some people that couldn't have been described as Ukrainian, especially those in the Black Earth region, ended up living in the Russia within. Although there is an argument that the USSR wasn't an ethnic nation state, very few of these people would identify as Ukrainians at this point. So the question is, how did the Russia within affect individual and popular identity of such people? So these are the three questions.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I guess, all right, so I'm trying to keep all these questions straight. So I would say on Alaska repercussions, I suspect that, once again, Martina surely knows more than I do about this. I am curious about where, how and for what reasons the border was drawn in the sale between the Big Diomede and Little Diomede Island. There must be a reason why they chose that particular maritime border. But to my knowledge, I dig deep. I can't think of any. I mean, I think it was a sale. It was actually one of the relatively few cases, I would add here, where Russia parted with territory sort of voluntarily, not in the midst of a crisis. And there were a few such cases, and there's some borderline cases, for example, in Persia in the 18th century, or the return of the Ili Valley to China, actually, which was part of Russia, in essence, for 10 years between 1871 and 1881, was actually given back to China subsequently. As to the Kuril Islands, the Japanese government claims the first 4 of those islands going up from Hokkaido. As recently as last year, I think in conjunction with the war, claims that they were illegally taken by the USSR at the end of the war. The USSR, as I understand it, was taking the last of those islands even after the Japanese had had signed unconditional surrender there in early September of 1945. And that there was a good argument for at least a couple of those islands really being considered part of Hokkaido, that is the northernmost large island, I guess I would say, of Japan, where Stalin incidentally sought some occupation rights, and the United States actually denied those and said basically no. But the Soviet Union, I guess, compensated by taking the islands all the way down. There's a lot of debate about sort of who discovered those and who was there first. I've been reading a very pro-Russian book that says we were there in the 17th century and we were there first, and the Japanese were, they weren't even on Hokkaido yet, et cetera, et cetera. But this is a territorial dispute that still stands, one can say, and so it's an unresolved one. The second, Jeff Feltman, who is a fellow here for the month of February, a very interesting person. Thank you, Jeff. It has to do with the significance of the borders inside the USSR, like how meaningful were they? And I think there is, I guess I would say they became quite important later. That's for sure. Stalin said at one point, I think to some Ukrainian writers who had come to him and had raised the issue of the borders, he said, we actually change our borders too often. We should stop doing this. We're irritating Russians. He said, it doesn't really matter, where we live, because this is all the USSR. And I think to some extent that was true. And yet we can see, I think, in these commissions that people clearly took this seriously. It did mean It had implications, I would say, maybe, Jeff, primarily in the interwar era, I would say in particular, when there was a concerted effort to promote non-Russian languages and cultures. And I think in that sense, it did matter on what side of the border you were. If you were on the Ukrainian side, then Ukrainianization, that is the schools being in Ukrainian and so forth, was going to be there was going to be a much more concerted effort along those lines than there would be if you were on the other side. So I think it did have significance even at the time, and I think people understood that perhaps intuitively. And then we know that it had great significance later, and I have to say that some of these modifications, actually, there were modifications that occurred even in the 50s and 60s, and I don't know a lot about these. I still haven't gotten this far. In some cases, just moving like a few settlements one way or the other, like from Russia to Kazakhstan or the other way around. There were lots of these kinds of things that were still going on in the 50s and 60s. And I don't know exactly, here I'll claim ignorance. I haven't looked deeply enough into this yet to be able to explain why. I think in some cases they were trying to resolve sort of ethnic issues, putting people on the sort of the right side of the border. In some cases it was economic. In some cases a river changes its course and that changes the local dynamics. I suspect that the answers are myriad. That's at least what I would say at this point. And as to my son's question, which is quite long, putting his pop on the spot. Thank you. Yes. Just the essence of the question again. I just want to be sure that I'm getting it right.
Thanks God that he didn't put it. Thanks God that he didn't put it in verses. Maybe just take a look at it.
I just want to be sure that I have. There was an argument. A few of these people would identify as Ukrainians, but so the question is, how did Russia within affect individual and popular identity in such people? I think this is also a really good question that I'll be brutally and directly honest and say that I don't think that I'm really quite in a position to answer it at this point. I think aside from maybe, there is a certain, I think, overlap between the previous question and this one. I would say aside from basically the answer that I just gave. But it would seem as though, let's say, for example, on that territory, here I'm speculating a little bit, and somebody who knows this better might be able to say more about it, but I would speculate that perhaps processes of assimilation, if you will, Russification, would be stronger depending on which side of the border you were on. Though once one gets to the 50s, 60s, and 70s, I'm not sure how strong of an effect that it would have had. I think the internal borders do become less important after the Second World War, but at the same time, I would hesitate to make any kind of statement along those lines categorically.
So please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. One question, would you regard the conflict between Russia and China about territorial issues like the Dalmansky Ostrov along the Amur River as solved? Officially, yes, but maybe when you travel to these regions, you see this Chinese business incursions into the Russian territory, taking over a lot of Russian land for agricultural works, agricultural businesses.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question. My sense is that on an official level, as you suggested, my understanding is that those territorial issues have been resolved. I think it happened primarily in the 1990s, if I understand correctly, maybe a little bit later into the early 2000s. And it's my understanding, though I'm wondering about the tilt of my sources in this regard, that they were resolved primarily to China's benefit. That is, I think China came out better. This is my sense. What I think is particularly interesting about that border, which of course is very long, and we're starting to have some really good books about this border as well. Soren Urbanski wrote a really nice book, and there's a recent book by two anthropologists, Carolyn Humphrey and Frank Billet, the name of which I can't remember, but basically it describes more or less in contemporary terms, maybe the last 20 years or so, the Russia-China border. And what I took from their book was actually how remarkably unconnected Russia and China are in their border region. I believe, what was it? The first or second, perhaps, railway bridge across I think it was the Amur River, appeared only just recently. And it's really quite striking. So one gets the sense that there's there's an incredible break at that border, which I don't think, well, I guess we're sitting in Berlin. I guess there was quite a break at another border here until 1989, but I'm not sure if there's another place that I can think of where the border, without maybe the exception of North Korea, where there would be that kind of stark border, the sort of lack of contact. I mean, the way these anthropologists wrote about it, of course, putting the word civilizations in quotation marks, is that these were really where two civilizations sort of meet and come face to face. But it's really quite stark. What'll happen further, I don't know, of course. I don't know. I hope that answers your question.
I think we are running out of time, and maybe we close the discussion. You're up for the last question, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Werth, for your very interesting presentation tonight. My name is Taini Armin. I come from Finland, so the border to Russia is very center of the history I've learned in school as well. You mentioned about the USSR and the borders within Russia when it came to ethnic borders, but how does that go together with the idea of those quite extensive forced relocations or deportations of the populations after the Second World War, even before, where people were certainly mixed, not according to the ethnic border.
I see. In other words, you mean, so for example, Chechens and so forth being sent to Kazakhstan.
Exactly, and Tatars from Crimea, for example, and elsewhere. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I guess I would say that I think you're exactly right that the populations then in some ways got mixed in a way that they hadn't been before. To my knowledge, there was no way in which, for example, the movement of a considerable number of, let's say, non-Kazakhs to Kazakhstan, since a number of those national groups, Koreans also from the Far East, as I recall, also wound up in Kazakhstan. I don't think the Kazakh character, let us say, of the Kazakh Republic within the USSR was ever called into question as a result of that. Probably the greatest questions pertained, as they do, I guess, today, pertained to the border between Kazakhstan and Russia itself, which were not a function necessarily of at least large-scale population transfers. But I mean, I think it's a characteristic, isn't it, of I guess ever since those large population movements between Greece and Turkey at the end of the First World War, that one of the ways of dealing with these sort of the problems of ethnic boundaries has been ethnic cleansing of various forms. In some cases, literally genocide. In some cases, forced movements in the way that you're suggesting. Some of them, how shall I put it, a bit more voluntary than others. But ultimately coercion being prominent in virtually all of those cases. So in some ways, alas, I suppose, it seems to me that, well, the combination of this kind of the idea of ethnicity and people being divided along ethnicity and the introduction of borders, in many cases has produced, I would say, forms of ethnic cleansing. But if I'm understanding the question, it seems to me that I don't think the Chechen Republic, for example, disappeared as a result of the expulsions. I think that maybe somebody knows this. I think the Republic continued to exist. And then in 1957, those people, many of them at least, were allowed to go back. But their destination, shall we say, its status as the Kazakh Republic, I don't think was put in any question over that. Am I understanding your question? First of all, I should basically make sure of that. Yeah? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for being here, for asking questions, and thank you, Paul. That was great. It was a great talk, and
Thank you for the
I
introduction.
enjoyed it very much.